J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about something that I think is interesting given the nature of our culture. That we believe in a lot of interesting things, even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in God. You still have a set of beliefs. Sometimes it's driven by pop culture, by a movie, by movies and books, by things that we read, right? Or that we fear at our kind of base level fears we have about unseen realities. And so today what we're going to talk about is it reasonable to believe in angelic beings? I mean, we hear about these things on the pages of the New Testament and the pages of the Old Testament. And the question is there any good reason to believe these things exist? Before we get to a case that could be made from Scripture, I always want to start by kind of looking at a more abstracted version of this. In other words, whatever you believe about God, whatever you believe about the nature of the world, we have two books that have been presented to us by God. The book of Scripture and the book of nature, the book of special revelation and the book of natural revelation. There are some things we could even just think about viewing the world with just our empirical senses, just our five senses, that we could actually make a case for. Maybe even present a case from just clear thinking about any number of issues before we dive into the book of Scripture to see if the book of Scripture, look, we believe that God has written both those books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and that these things tell the same story in two different ways. So we shouldn't find ourselves in a place, really, where we think, oh, you know what, I've discovered something over here that makes no sense to me over there. No, as a matter of fact, these two things should be telling us the same story. And where they don't, well, then we can ask ourselves the question, which of the two books am I misinterpreting? Because it's possible for us to misinterpret both, one or the other, or both. So what I want to do in this episode is make a case for angelic beings without dipping our toes into the Scripture. In the next episode, we'll talk about more about what Scripture says about the nature of angelic beings. But we do, most of us, believe in things that are immaterial. And so I'll make a couple of arguments, really, for the existence of angelic immaterial beings. I'll show you two kind of classic historic cases that have been made by Christian thinkers of the past, and I'll throw one on my own end. But before I even do that, let me just offer the unique setting we're in, and let me offer a claim that I think if you think about it long enough, you'll realize it's true even of yourself, if you can remember before you were a Christian, or if you know people right now who aren't Christians. You realize that as a culture, we are more and more inclined to believe in immaterial beings. A recent Harris poll, I think maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, you can Google it to find it, a Harris poll was surveying how many people in America still believed in God. And they did notice that the trajectory of people who believe in God seems to be declining. At the same time, they discovered that the belief in ghosts is increasing. Look, you run into this kind of thing doing homicides, working homicides. Now, I've written about what we're going to talk about today, including the Harris poll. I think it's linked actually there. In an article that you can find at our website at coldcasechristianity.com, at coldcasechristianity.com. It's just called, Is It Reasonable to Believe in Angelic Beings? So if you look at that article, you'll be able to get a sense of where it is I'm headed. And also, that article is printable. I try to make all the articles. We've got a plug-in to our website that I pay for every year, and it simply allows you to hit a link that says PDF, and you can download that file without having any of the stuff on the side, whatever's on the side of that web page, whatever makes it look like a web page, all of that's been removed, so it looks like a very clean PDF file with just the title and the text. So that'll help you to kind of review what we're going to talk about in this episode of our program. Now, let's return to something I noticed a number of years ago working homicides. After you do work a homicide, investigate a homicide, eventually life has to return to normal for the family that was a victim. And you'll notice certain cultural truths about what we believe in terms of ghosts. I don't know, we had the situation in our neighborhood, maybe it's actually one neighborhood away from us, where a young man, you say young, he was in his 20s, he was suffering from schizophrenia. He was arguing with his parents to the point where the parents had to ask him to leave the house. He could no longer live at home. So they did not let him live at home anymore, and he left. And when he returned, he came back one night, and he shot both of his parents while they were sleeping in their bedroom. So that house had a double murder. A double murder in the bedroom. You realize that by law, I think it's by law in the state of California, realtors must release information that if somebody has died in the house, they must tell the next owner, the next potential buyer, that the last buyer died in this house. Why? Why does anyone need to know that? Why does it matter? I mean, why couldn't you just buy the house without knowing whether or not, why do you care what happened to that person? Why do you care if that person left the house, died of old age in the house, or was murdered? What does it matter to you? Well, because there's a sense in which if you knew that the last residence in that master bedroom, that even if they completely redid it, they cleaned it all up, they pulled the drywall off the walls, okay? They re-drywalled it, they repainted it, they recarpeted it. It's completely new. There's not a single thing in that room anymore that was there on the night of the murder. There are still some people who will not buy that house because they don't want to live in a house that is haunted, or has potential, or the first time something weird happens while they're living in that house, they will assume it was the haunted beings who died in that house. Why is it that we still have this notion or this fear of immaterial beings? But then when we talk about angels or demons in the New Testament, if you're not a believer, you're like, hey, your belief in God is actually culturally declining in America, while our belief in ghosts. Why do you think the paranormal activity movies are so popular? Why do you think it is that when you go home, if you saw those in a theater, when you return to your house, you find yourself looking around each corner? Why is that happening? Well, that's happening because you actually think that's possible. I mean, why do we look at Ouija boards in a certain way? Why do we trust any of this nonsense? Because it turns out we have an innate understanding, an innate belief in immaterial things. The only question is, are the immaterial things described in Scripture reasonable to believe in? And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode by simply reviewing classic arguments made for the existence of angelic beings. So we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll take the first look at an argument made by Thomas Aquinas arguing for the existence of angelic beings. We'll do that right after the break.
If you're like me, I bet you sometimes feel bad that you don't share what you believe as a Christian as much as you'd like. Sometimes it's because we're not well equipped. When I ask people why they don't share, some of these folks have even gone through, some of us have all taken classes in evangelism. I know I did as a new believer. You probably did too. Yet we still don't find ourselves sharing like we should, right? It turns out if you ask people, why don't you share even though you've been trained to do so, it usually comes down to some sense of fear. That I'm going to be caught flat-footed. I'm not quite sure what I would say if they ask a question. I don't want to look stupid. I hear these kinds of responses all the time when it comes to why people won't share what they believe as Christians. And I get that. I certainly have been there. That's why it's important for us to begin a process of training to get ready to make the case for what we believe. You'll be surprised at how much it'll help you and encourage you to actually start to make the case. I started by just mastering a simple idea. I believe as a police officer that there are objective, transcendent moral truths, and that these truths are obligations between persons. I think you have to have certain justifications before you can do certain things. Where do those ideas come from? Am I the source of those? Well, if that's the case, then if you disagree with me, there's nobody to arbitrate between us. So clearly those moral truths can't come from individuals. Do they come from people groups? Well, if that's the case, we can't argue if a different people group has a different set of moral truth claims. No, there's got to be something bigger than people groups. Is it nations? Well, if that's the case, why would we say that what Germany was doing in World War II was wrong? It can't be wrong. If the nation itself gets to decide if it's right, there's something that even transcends nations. If there's a Star Trek universe, there's something that transcends planets. There are some things you shouldn't do to Klingons or Romulans. Now think about that for a second. If there's a source of moral law that transcends the entire universe, and if we know that all moral truth claims are actually obligations between persons, who is the objective, transcendent, moral person that is the source of the laws in the universe? When I started to think about that and kind of practice that in my head, it started to be something I would talk about with my friends who weren't believers. There's a set of disciplines that I can teach you that detectives actually use every day to investigate truth claims and then communicate them to juries that I think will help you be a better evangelist, a better Christian case maker, to live a more robust Christian life that'll move you from a blind faith to a forensic faith.
Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at an argument made by Thomas Aquinas. I'm going to actually try to give you 3 in this episode. I've got enough time here, I think, on my timer to be able to give you 3 arguments for the existence of angelic beings. But some of these arguments are predicated on the existence of God, because they're being made by Christians who assume that, at least, right? And so it's going to be a lot easier, of course, as you might assume, to argue for angelic beings and the existence of angelic beings if you're arguing from a deistic or theistic worldview in which the existence of God has already been decided. And that's why for a lot of us, we're going to have to learn how to make that case for God's existence. And you'll see I've done that in a number of videos on our YouTube channel. I've done that on a number of the NRBtv shows. So I'm just going to ask you to go back to some of those shows to actually refresh your memory on how to make a case for this, just to make a case for the first thing, which is for God's existence to begin with, okay? But I want to share with you what Thomas Aquinas argued in the first of his Summa Theologica, the volumes that he wrote. The first volume, he's got like 15 questions. Now, Aquinas was a 13th century theologian. So we're going back now to some thinking that is 700 years ago. Well, actually, 21st century, 800 years ago. So, I mean, that's really, if you think about it, pretty remarkable that we have been thinking about these issues deeply, philosophically, rationally, for this many years. The Christian worldview is historically thoughtful. Now, you may not find that that's what you're experiencing in 2020 as a Christian. Maybe you aren't bumping into people who think that deeply about their faith. But that is not the tradition of Christianity. This has been a deeply thoughtful, rational worldview for centuries. And whether we treat it that way today, that's on us. And we ought to be thinking about continuing that tradition, that thoughtful tradition of being able to make a case both from natural revelation and from special revelation about why we believe these things are true. And Aquinas is a great place to start. Now, I'm going to dumb this down because I want to get it in 5 points. I'm not going to repeat all 15 questions that he asked. But I want to at least kind of share with you the thinking he has kind of worked through, and I'm going to throw it really slow down the center of the plate so that you can smack it, okay? And so when you want to be able to repeat it, hopefully you'll be able to remember it. So let's go ahead and show you the argument in 5 steps. The first step is simply this. It's that a good God creates beings in his image. A good God creates, that's not that, look, God is love. And it would seem to me that a good God would create beings with the capacity, for example, to love. They would be in the image of God in that they have the ability to love others. And this, I think, is a reasonable inference, right? That a good God creates beings that possess attributes that are his attributes. Now, granted, we will rebel. We have also a fallen, sinful nature, and that is what distinguishes us from God. But that's the enigma of man, right? That we are both noble and capable of great rebellion. Number 2, he argues that God is an immaterial conscious being. And he has created humans with an aspect of his own nature, consciousness, even though we are material beings. So he has created humans as material conscious beings. There's your spectrum. God is an immaterial conscious being. We're at the other end as material conscious beings. And consciousness, number 3, is not a function of the material body. Remember, brain states are different than mental states. And that is something that we've talked about on this show, that I've argued for. If you just type in mind and brain on our website, you will see that there's articles that distinguish and gives you all the differences between mind and brain, and there are many. And consciousness is not a function of the material body. because it's an immaterial. Mental states are immaterial. They cannot be weighed. They cannot be measured. They cannot be assessed the same as material functions. They are not simply your brain firing, your neurons firing. Your thoughts are different than your brain states. They're different than your mental states. Therefore, he concludes, number 4, that humans are both material and immaterial beings. Now, what he's saying there, think about this, what he's saying here is that if you can see a difference between your mental states of your mind and the physical states and properties of your brain, well then why would you not believe that there's a difference between your body and your soul? Your mind is immaterial, and the arguments for mind could equally apply to the arguments for soul. We are soulish creatures in the possession of bodies. This idea of being dual creatures, both soul and body, and both mind and brain, is not that to me, the problem of mind that philosophers typically talk about is how do we explain this immaterial thing when we're living in an entirely material universe? Brains make sense in an entirely material, physicalist, deterministic universe, but minds don't fit the paradigm because they are immaterial. How do we explain these things? And what he's arguing here is that if you can infer that we have minds that's different than your brain, then why would you not believe we have souls that are different than your body? Another immaterial nature. Now, what he's described here is this range between humans and God. And that brings us to his 5th step. Let's take a look at that. And here's what he says in his 5th step. He says, look, in the continuum of beings, right, humans on one end, God on the other, it's reasonable to assume some sort of immaterial, conscious being that is not God at one end, but is not human at the other end, that lies somewhere in between these two categories of God at one end and man at the other. Incorporeal substances, he says, rank between God and corporeal creatures. Now, the medium compared to one extreme appears to be the other extreme, as what is tepid compared to heat seems to be cold, and thus it is said that angels compared to God are material and corporeal, not, however, as if anything corporeal existed in them. In other words, there is something about angels that puts them in this range between humans and God. So his argument is, if I can make a good case for the immaterial nature of mind, why would we not believe there is a set of beings that share something about our nature, but share something about God's, that lie in the spectrum range between one and the other? Kind of heady, right? But it's interesting to kind of think about how Thomas Aquinas reviews this, how he thinks about it, how he makes a case for it in 5 steps. Anyway, that is his case. I'm going to take a break, come back, and give you 2 cases that are a little more recent than that 13th century case made by Thomas Aquinas.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Can we explain the origin of life from non-life?
Yeah, I think detectives use this process where you use kind of investigative questions, right? The what, where, when, how questions. And so if you ask those same questions about the origin of life, you see some really apparent problems from trying to explain the origin of life in our universe, unless, of course, we have an originator of life, a divine originator of life. For example, if you ask, well, where could it occur? Well, they've tried to locate it in the oceans, the origin of life, or on land, the origin of life, or in the atmosphere, the origin, or under the tectonic plates, or in space. Every one of these locations is insufficient to explain the origin of life, largely because there's this chicken and egg problem. You need the machines that build proteins to exist in order to build the proteins, but the machines themselves are built from proteins. There's always a chicken and egg problem about how at the smallest, most foundational, simplest levels of life we can get this thing to appear when you have this chicken and egg problem. But not only that, if you look at just the when did it occur? Well, it appears that life on our planet is it's just there's not enough time in the history of our planet to get the kind of complex life. You see life emerging on the planet very, very early. Even the most adamant scientist who's an atheist will have to point to life existing in a pretty robust form pretty early. So the problem you have is not a good when, not a good where. Of course, how? That's even the biggest issue. It turns out that all of life is driven by information. That's what conquers the chicken and egg problem. The information in the genome is what conquers all of this because it gives a complex set of instructions that are expected to be both heard and met. The problem is there's no example anywhere in history, as Stephen C. Meyer says, where information comes from anything other than an intelligent source. So the one question that seems to be missing out of the equation, when it's all a what, when, how, is the who question. Because who's can actually overcome all the problems in the other questions. But of course, nobody wants to ask the who question because that who ends up being the one thing we're trying to reject usually, which is the existence of a divine creator who could overcome the unlikely appearance of life in our universe.
Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a couple of arguments that are made in the 17th and 19th centuries by Christian thinkers. The first one is by a man whose name is Johannes Kunstedt. Now, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. We were looking at, my wife is German, and so we were looking at this German name to see if we got it right, Kunstedt. But I think this is how it's pronounced. But if I'm wrong, you can write to me in the comment section of this video and complain about how I messed it up. But his argument is interesting in that it's similar to Thomas Aquinas, and that he's arguing for a range. Let's just put it on the wall for you. Okay, so what he's basically doing is he's arguing that there are no gaps basically in nature. That he's reasoning that purely spiritual beings such as angels, they've got to exist in this continuum. Here's how he puts it. Number one, there are purely corporeal beings like rocks and stones. Now, what he means by using the word corporeal is he means that they have a body. They are physical body-ish type of creatures, right? Or not creatures in this case, just part of creation. So stones, for example, they don't have a spirit, they don't have a soul, they are just body, they are just physical. So there are these kinds of created objects. And then there are, number two, partly corporeal and partly spiritual beings, which is where we fall in. We have bodies, but we also possess souls. We are also non-physical entities in our soulish nature. And then, why then would you think, if there's a bunch of number one and a bunch of number two, why wouldn't we believe that there's a bunch of number three? In other words, there would just be another being in the continuum of beings moving from purely corporeal or bodily to purely spiritual. So number three, there would be purely spiritual beings, and those would be angels. So his argument, and he was a 17th century Lutheran professor and theologian, moves in those three steps. Do you see how he's getting there? It's very similar to what Aquinas is trying to argue. And so I just wanted you to see that secondary argument. But we've got time to do one more argument as well. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is from a 19th century theologian, and his name is Charles Hodge. Now Hodge, he made a case for angelic beings based on a varied existence of what he calls irrational beings. So it's a little bit different, right? He argued that there are irrational beings that exist in numbers, then it's reasonable to assume that rational beings must also exist in numbers. But let's just take a look at his argument. It's really in 2.5 points, really. Here's what he says. He says, number one, there are more than one kind of irrational beings like insects and animals. Now, granted, you could argue this is really a level of degree, but he's going to call these kinds of beings irrational in the sense they don't have the rational capacity of humans, right? And number two, he says, there should be more than one kind of rational being. In other words, there's multiplicity in the realm of irrational beings. Why would there not be multiplicity in the world of rational beings? Would we humans think we're the only ones that are like this? There's lots of different kinds of insects. Why wouldn't we think we are alone? Why would we think we are alone in terms of our rational capacity? He says it this way: there is every reason to presume that the scale of being among rational creatures is as extensive as that in the animal world. Okay, that's an interesting argument. This is from Charles Hodge, a 19th century Princeton theologian. So maybe you're thinking, well, not a lot of good stuff's come out of Princeton, but there was a time when a lot of good stuff did come out of Princeton, and I would say that this is at least one way of looking at it. Now how do we then take all of these arguments and kind of put them together in a way that kind of makes sense to the people around us who maybe don't even believe in God? Okay. Look, I think we have a natural, we talked about this at the beginning of the show, we have a natural, innate inclination that we kind of accept the existence of a spiritual realm. This is why belief in ghosts is really in the maximum. There are more and more people are believing in ghosts. So the most people actually do believe in immaterial. If nothing else, you could ask your friends, do you believe in your immaterial mental experience? Because if you don't have an immaterial mental experience, you can't even assess if I'm telling you something true. If all of your thoughts are simply dictated by physical processes, how can you trust that the physical processes in your brain are even allowing you to think clearly about what I just said? If you don't have an immaterial freedom from physical processes, how are you even free to make decisions about what is true? How are you free to create? How are you free to love? How are you even culpable for anything you might do if you weren't free to do it? So it turns out we already believe in something immaterial. We believe in our mental experience, our mind, as an immaterial experience that is detached from the deterministic experiences of our brain. And even people who deny this would recognize that to deny that there's a difference between mind and brain is really to sacrifice your freedom to some degree, because you'd have to admit that your freedom, your experience of freedom, is an illusion, because what's really happening is that you have a mental process that's physical in your brain, with your neurons are firing in a certain way, causing dominoes to fall in a certain way, and therefore your free choices really weren't that free. They were just caused by things you couldn't control firing in your brain that happened prior to that alleged decision, which is just an illusion. And this is why Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and a philosopher, and a very funny one, I think. I like listening to him. He takes that position that these things are illusory. But the question is, if I believe in an immaterial reality, you already believe in immaterial. That gives me good reason then to believe in a soul, because a soul is simply the immaterial version of us. Right? Which is why we believe in life after death. We believe that if you've got an immaterial brain, why would you think that a physical death would affect anything that's immaterial about you? So again, we've already opened the door to immaterial things. And it turns out that if you're not somebody who restrains your beliefs to those things that are immaterial and described in Scripture, you will open your beliefs to the things that are immaterial that are described by pop culture. And that's why as we see a reduction in belief in God, we see an increase in belief in things like ghosts. And we see that happening statistically across our country. And that's why we demand that a realtor will tell us if somebody dies in a house, because we're concerned that there might be a ghost in the house. Really, there are good reasons to believe in immaterial things. The question is, which immaterial things will you believe in, and what is going to be your authority when it comes to those things? That's why next week when we meet again, we'll be talking about what the Bible has to say about these immaterial things that we call angelic beings. So until then, I'll see you right back here next time at Cold Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.